Now, participants, I'm not going to get into the detail of the constraints because they're available in your notes, but this is just to highlight the fact that constraints differ. They vary from country to country. They differ over time. They differ over a firm's sectoral choice, and they're influenced and firm sectoral choices are influenced by the types of constraints faced. So you'll see that firms in the manufacturing sector, for example, in Ethiopia, there was a study undertaken by women in manufacturing in Ethiopia. So they found significant obstacles in accessing finance that was more pronounced for women-led SMEs. But the woman's self-perception and informal cultural norms and unconscious biases place additional constraints on women. So while women-owned large and medium-sized manufacturing firms were found to have confronted the same challenges as their male counterparts, there was the fact that these cultural norms and unconscious biases place these additional constraints that were specific to women. So I think it's just important to say that, and it's important to reflect and to understand that not all constraints will be the same for all groups of women. Not all constraints will be the same for all groups of firms, of women-owned enterprises. Indeed, we see, and the World Bank Women in Trade study tells us that constraints for women and their participation in trade-related roles, both at the border and beyond the border, are varied. So, for example, beyond the border constraints are important in that they explain how limitations confronting women can severely reduce women's access to trade-related employment and services. And then some of the at-the-border constraints talk specifically about barriers that are related to the way that goods and services cross international borders, such as higher trading costs and discrimination at border crossings. But it's equally important, as the study tells us, to look very closely at what the beyond the border constraints are. Now, moving goods across borders can pose a number of challenges for women. And these difficulties are accentuated for women, and they can be traditional trade barriers such as tariffs and non-tariff measures, burdensome customs requirements, red tape, poor infrastructure, and even physical security. Now, an International Trade Center study highlighted the fact that women-owned businesses, which are smaller and tend to be disproportionately affected by non-tariff measures, including lengthy custom procedures, port handling, and excessive paperwork, are a reality for these women-owned businesses. Now, in many countries, women work predominantly in the services sector, and there the constraints differ. And the services sector face higher barriers to trade than in the manufacturing sector, where most of the male labor force is employed. So again, we understand and we are alerted to the fact that constraints differ. So non-tariff measures were found to be more burdensome in the services sector for women-owned for women in the services sector, specifically for women-owned exporting businesses that were found to include product standards and certification procedures, and customs and bureaucratic procedures, and obtaining import licenses that made it costly for some firms to export and import in the services sector. And of course, in the manufacturing sectors, those obstacles in one of the studies related specifically to customs procedures and foreign regulations. So again, I think it's very important to understand the different type of constraints that confront women-led businesses. And of course, in services, obstacles are related to domestic regulations, but also to the establishment of foreign affiliates and obtaining of visas. So it's important to understand constraints in the wider definition and experiences that women-owned enterprises, both in the formal sector and in the informal sector, confront. And you can read in greater detail the factors holding back women's business performance in Africa that was undertaken by the World Bank, that identified these various factors, starting with legal discrimination and including social norms, finance and assets, as particular constraints that limited women's and particularly their ability to grow their businesses. And I think it's important for you to be able to look at those constraints, to understand what they are, and to know why holding back women's performance in Africa will impact on the ability of women-owned businesses to participate and to leverage and to maximize the opportunities in the AFCFTA. So again, there are constraints for women in their trade-related roles, but these constraints are varied. They are not just limited to at-the-border constraints. They're not just limited to tariffs, to non-tariff measures, to discrimination and harassment at the border, but they also include beyond-the-border constraints, access to education, finance, digital technologies, access to legal discrimination, legal discrimination, socio-cultural and behavioral constraints. I think it's very important to interrogate what these constraints are. Now, we're going to look very closely, very quickly at informal cross-border trade, because I'm cognizant of the time. And we see that informal cross-border trade is among the major activities for self-employed women in the informal sector, with women constituting approximately 70% of informal cross-border traders in SADC and nearly 60% in West and Central Africa. And again, as small-scale and informal cross-border traders, women continue to face disproportionately higher trade barriers that prevent them from leveraging the full potential of informal cross-border trade and will prevent them from benefiting from new trade and economic opportunities inherent in the AFCFTA. I will leave you to examine more closely through the readings that are provided, what some of these constraints are, but at a very high level. There was an UNCTAD study in 2019 that examined the situation for informal cross-border traders in Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, and found that some of the most significant challenges confronting female informal cross-border traders included limited capacity to trade, higher value goods, bribery and corruption at the border, limited capacity to diversify set of goods traded, limited access to financial resources, misinformation about customs procedures and regulations, harassment, personal safety, confiscation of goods at the border. And again, to stop and consider the situation in your countries. Do you think that women face disproportionately higher trade barriers as informal cross-border traders? So we acknowledge and we accept that indeed men face the same barriers a lot of the times, but do you think that because of educational disparities, of cultural norms, of the social norms that we spoke about, do you think that impacts on the kind of physical, the kind of potential sexual harassment that confronts women at the border? And when we're talking about these disproportionate challenges that confront women informal cross-border traders, without detracting from the fact that male cross-border traders face similar challenges, do you think that female cross-border trader face disproportionate challenges or are particularly disadvantaged by the trade obstacles confronting them? And then very quickly, we also see that non-tariff barriers are more burdensome for women traders. And there's the common non-tariff barriers reported on the continent that are custom and trade procedures, immigration procedures, and transport-related requirements. And of course, there's the length and the complexity and the cost of trade procedures that remain a particular obstacle for actors with limited capacities and frequently cross the border. And again, to understand women's educational disparities, the differences, gender-specific differences in education, do you think that this impacts on the research findings are telling us that it does impact on the ability of women to process, to engage on these complex trade procedures. But do you think that these trade procedures pose an additional obstacle to female informal cross-border and small-scale traders? So in the context of the AFCFTA, we're really looking at trade facilitation measures through the introduction of a continental simplified trade regime that can help small and informal traders benefit from the AFCFTA. Now, you know better than I do, those of you certainly from the EAC and COMESA will be able to talk to what the successes of the simplified trade regime in EAC and COMESA, because when we're talking about a continental simplified trade regime, we're not talking about starting from scratch. We're talking about building from the regional simplified trade regimes and the successes, the best practices there, and what can help to bring informal traders into this formal trading system through the introduction of a continental simplified trade regime that builds on the EAC and COMESA simplified trade regimes, so that informal cross-border traders, small-scale traders can benefit from the AFCFTA. And we'll see in the next slide that the continental simplified trade regime we're talking about here that can offer simplified certificates of origin, common list of goods, and and value not exceeding a certain limit should qualify for duty-free market access, simplified custom documents, assisting in completing and clearing procedures, and in answering trade-related queries. So this, when we talk about agenda-responsive trade facilitation measures, in the context of the AFCFTA, we are looking at a continental simplified trade regime. Now, what would a continental simplified trade regime entail? And are we starting from scratch? Is this something new? No, absolutely not. We're looking at building upon the East African Community and COMESA simplified trade regime, and we're really looking at something that can bring small traders and informal cross-border traders into the formal trading system. Now, the inclusion specifically of female informal cross-border traders into a formal trading arrangement would support their participation in new export opportunities created by the AFCFTA and really contribute to unleashing the strong entrepreneurial potential of this vulnerable group. But again, we're not talking about starting from scratch. We are talking about how we can build, how we can learn, how we can improve upon best practices at the regional level and moving up to a continental level, how we can make a continental simplified trade regime be stronger, provide further assistance for small and informal cross-border traders to benefit from the AFCFTA. And some of the ways in which they can benefit is to be provided with simplified customs documents, common list of goods that qualify for duty-free status, assistance in completing customs procedures, and you will be able to see this on the slide that sets out what this assistance in a continental simplified trade regime could entail. But I would really like to ask you at this point, because it's so critically important, a continental simplified trade regime in the context of the AFCFTA, to challenge yourself to not just limit yourself to the readings and to commentators, but to extend your understanding and to dig deeper into what a continental simplified trade regime would mean for your country, what the experience of your country has been at the REX level in participating in the simplified trade regime. Has it provided this type of assistance to small and informal traders? If so, how? What were the challenges? How could a continental simplified trade regime under the CFTA improve, benefit, and learn from those experiences? Because as I said, this is going to be of particular importance in ensuring that the AFCFTA leaves no one behind. And we're talking about ensuring that informal cross-border traders, small-scale traders have equal access to economic opportunities under the AFCFTA through a continental simplified trade regime. And now, I just want to comment very quickly about the constraints, again, confronting informal cross-border traders, particularly non-tariff barriers that tend to be more burdensome for women traders. You know that some of the most common non-tariff barriers reported on the continent include custom and trade procedures, immigration procedures, transport-related requirements and roadblocks. They also the number of complexities, the cost of trade procedures that remain a particular obstacle for actors who with limited capacities, but who frequently cross the border. But to understand, is this a particular challenge? Are women particularly disadvantaged? So we understand that both men and women face similar constraints when it comes to non-tariff barriers. But because of the inequalities, because of educational disparities, because of socio-cultural norms, those kind of barriers, do you think in the context of your countries that women small-scale traders, informal cross-border traders are particularly disadvantaged? There's also the problem or the challenges of the export and import permits and sanitary and phytosanitary certification for agricultural products, which makes them costly but prohibitively costly for women. And in the context of the AFCFTA, and when we go on to examine the agreement more thoroughly and trade facilitation measures under the agreement, we want to talk about a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda that improves the safety and reduces the time and cost involved in trading, particularly for small-scale and informal cross-border traders, because it is this gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda that will be able to strengthen their trading opportunities and increase the opportunities for regional trade. Participants, we have now come to the conclusion of Module 2, and I would like to leave you with a few high-level messages that have emerged from this module. It's been a long one. I've been talking for a while, but I now hand over to you to understand the course content, to go through it more slowly, take your time, consult the readings, and again, bring it back to your situation, national development priorities. What is the situation in your country confronting women and men in these various economic roles, in various subsectors, industries? Are there gender inequalities, even if it's just at an anecdotal level? Has any of these research findings, the data that's been provided with you, has it triggered your understanding of what needs to be analyzed and what needs to be focused and emphasized in the course of either designing gender-sensitive or gender-responsive trade policies in the AFCFTA, or contributing and supporting to the design and then the implementation of these policies? So very quickly, my high-level messages at the conclusion of this module are: for women to gain from new opportunities in agriculture in the context of the AFCFTA, it will be necessary to integrate a gender dimension in the design of a new generation of agricultural policies and complementary measures that resets and spurs inclusive agricultural development. And we spoke about what some of these interventions could be. But again, I'd like you to build on that. That was but a start. You are requested to build on those interventions and to think in the context of your country, what could be done differently? How can we build back better in new and business unusual climate of the AFCFTA? We also have the opportunity through the AFCFTA and revisions to industrial policies and responses for policymakers to support more equitable strategies that expand on women's economic opportunities as an inherent part of inclusive industrialization in the era of the AFCFTA. And as AU member states embark on negotiations to open up trade and services, emphasis should be placed on enhancing skills and employability for both men and for women. But because women's employment is primarily concentrated in lower value and lower paid services sectors, careful consideration should be given to advancing productive employment and decent jobs for women in services trade towards a more inclusive and equitable growth path. I'd also like to conclude with importance and just emphasizing and highlighting the importance of a continental simplified trade regime, which builds upon the EAC and COMESA simplified trade regime, and particularly in looking at how a continental simplified trade regime could help to bring informal traders into the formal trading system and support their participation in new trade opportunities created by the AFCFTA, and to challenge you about a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda. What would this trade facilitation agenda entail? So we're talking about business unusual. We're talking about doing things differently. There have been a number of trade facilitation interventions at the REX level, but what would a gender-responsive, dedicated, targeted trade facilitation agenda that improves the safety and reduces the time and cost of trading, particularly for small-scale and informal cross-border traders, and enable them to participate in new trade opportunities under the AFCFTA? What would a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda entail? Participants, thank you for your time. Thank you for your commitment. I look forward to Module 3, where we will be getting into operationalizing an approach to gender mainstreaming. But it was important for us to unpack, to analyze, to examine gender-specific constraints, because it's through understanding and unpacking and responding to these gender-specific constraints that we can ensure gender equitable opportunities in the AFCFTA. So thank you again for your time, and until we meet again for Module 3. Thank you.